Hello and welcome to the 13th episode of Global Paul's Rethink the Future podcast, dealing with our market-orientated way of life, and more specifically our consumerist one. It is for anyone who is questioning the givenness of our way of life and whether or not it is worth pursuing, it is worth preserving, I suppose is the better way of putting it. So in today's episode, I'm going to be looking at art that relates with the way of life that we could potentially engender beyond the holding pattern that we currently accept for ourselves. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So I've covered it off in prior episodes. So, the nature of the exceptions that can be made in order to potentialise, our civilization beyond the holding pattern that we accept of consumerism, of reducing our agency into buying and selling. And so one of the things which I want to look at is if you are going to be looking at art as a way, an artful way of life, and so an ethos which has at its core the principles of art, not as defined through the aesthetic sensibilities, but essentially that's something that's grounded in our very being, as it were, then how do you go about facilitating that? So let's talk about that. So one of the things which I have touched upon, but it's important from the context of obviously the topic that we're talking about now, is it relates to what we accept for ourselves. And if we're looking at the way how we're ennobling human action, and obviously to ennoble the way how things are produced beyond, I suppose, the circumscribed nature of, or the impoverished way that a commodity is produced, then we're looking at the potential of where the art or the way of life that is engendered that would obviously, with enough time, then the provisioning of goods in inverted commas would be done, artfully. So what needs to occur in order for this to initiate that potential is to look at business activity. Because if you consider that, if we're looking at action, human action, and then human action is being reduced into business activity, and what underwrites business activity is profit maximisation. All right, but if that profit maximisation, and this is so let's just take that we're all entrepreneurs, because entrepreneurs is touted as being a model for work, because obviously it's, if you're looking at the nature of sovereignty, all right, not the sovereign that's removed from the drudgery of making a living, but sovereignty of the way of doing work, then an entrepreneur very much models our understanding of work in the sense that they're working for themselves. But they are commercially orientated in the sense that they are looking to maximise profit from their commercial endeavours. So when you're looking at artfulness, you're really looking at the way how human activity, by defined through a commercial activity and what underwrites it, and so what underwrites it. Okay, so if it's profit maximisation, and that the maximisation of profit is solely to pursue the vision that you have for yourself, so the lifestyle obsession that you are beholden to. Okay, so if we're looking at, and this is irrespective of whether or not it's an entrepreneur or a wage earner, it's immaterial as to what we're talking about here. What legitimises the activity, or what we could consider to be commercial activity, is the goal that you're focused on. So if the goal is the unquestioned good of the good life that is encapsulated in a lifestyle, and lifestyle here embodies the sovereignty of a person that's removed from the drudgery of making a living, and so therefore they don't have the constraint of the imposition of time equals money, because essentially that equation has been answered, or has been answered. Then when you're looking at the way you're reframing human activity into something that's artful, you're really looking at that commercial activity in the way how that activity can change, can morph from what would be considered to be commercial activity to something that's more artful. So this is ultimately, so how do we do that? How is that achieved? Okay, so let's work back again. That our agency has been reduced into buying and selling, and so by default of commercial enterprise, that there is a market. Okay, now we've touched upon this in other episodes where the every single economic exchange that you enter into is always underwritten by the good of your time. So what would be considered to be an interpersonal exchange is in actual fact an intrapersonal exchange, because the good of your time underwrites every interpersonal, what we consider to be an interpersonal exchange. So it is the good of first order, as an economic good as such. So when you're looking at the way how business engage you and not as a person, this is a thing, they place you in a market. So you've suffered a reduction of agency by placing you in the market. So we talked about this, is that by placing you in a market, you are very much the first product that they secure. And you're securing your agency as a consumer potential customer. So when you're looking at the way, and if we're talking about the nature of that, you've got two agencies, you've got both buying and selling. So there's two markets, one for obviously for your consumption, the other one for your production. So you let the labour market and the consumer markets. So when you're looking at the way how a business, as far as a commercial enterprise, needs to approach you, in order to do this artfully, they're really looking at the way how the distinctions that they otherwise make, that they take as a given, don't need to be actually to be considered to be as such. They don't have to make the distinction between two markets, being the consumer market or the labour market. Because ultimately the pool of people, we're all people. This is the whole thing. There doesn't have to be a distinction that it's made, but this is where the art comes into it. Because if you consider that the way of doing business now is marketing and taking a market as a given, and we talked about the nature of there's no market for your time. If it's an intra-personal exchange, there is no market other than basically your orientation towards the economic good that you would secure for yourself. So in as far as that goes, it's inherently utopian. There is no market, and because that is the good that underwrites all other exchanges, they are subordinate or secondary to that time. So in actual fact, the market, in the sense of what underwrites it, is utopian. And yet the utopia that business takes as a given is the fact that a market exists. But there's nothing exists outside the orientation towards the exchange. And this is where an exception can be made of the exchange to potentialise your time beyond that. So when you're looking at the fact that a business doesn't have to make a distinction between the two markets, what's occurring there is a new way of doing things. And this is right. So the new way of doing things is that, okay, you are not addressing yourself as a consumer but as a person. And the way how you do that is you demonstrate that through the act that would make an exception of the exchange that you are in the market to, so what is considered to be secondary to your time. So the business makes an exception to potentialise you as a person, for you to see the value of your time, to potentialise your times in ways that makes art a possibility. Okay, because then what you're doing is that you're creating the culture outside the utopian fixation, as it were, or the orientation towards an exchange. You're actually orientating it beyond the exchange to your time in order for you to be potentialised to co-create the culture that is essentially the unmarket and that surrounds basically the exchange, because it's done within an ecosystem. So when you're looking at the way how art comes about, it is very much through the I call it the confluence of markets, where you're collapsing both the consumer market and the labour market. So I'll give you an example of why this is important, because if you're not aware of it, a lot of businesses will tout their what they call employee value proposition. So they have a unique selling proposition. So it's all about what makes them unique, and they have their values and all this other stuff. So they've got the unique value proposition, but there's an employee, which is an internal thing about how they engage their employees so they don't go AWOL, as it were. Okay, so you've got a lot of this relates to human resources, where they're looking at retention. So it relates to the way how a company would define their culture as being beholden to their enterprise and not consider actually culture as beyond obviously the boundaries of what they do. And this is the whole nature of that. When you engender something beyond, you're engendering a culture beyond the entity as such, where in the ecosystem all companies and people partake of that culture rather it being considered to be an asset of a business. There's a key distinction that occurs here when you do it. It's a lot more dynamic, and it's actually a true representation of culture, and it's not the impoverishment of culture or the work environment that business like to tout as being culture. It's just, you can't compare the two. You can't say that they're the same, because once again, that culture is beholden to a commercially orientated activity, and so then it's not really cultural at all. Or if it's the understanding, I think you can't really utilise the word when it's beholden to a narrow understanding of human action, but you can actually consider it to be culture if it goes beyond the orientation to the exchange to potentialise you as a person, because then it exists outside the market, the unmarket, to potentialise a new way of doing things, a new way of giving and receiving that relates to things being done artfully, that in and of itself is cultural and that engenders art as a result of it. All right, they're like worlds apart. All right, as much as that business like to lay claim to the word, I don't really think that they can to a degree when you consider it in the nature of the way I've just done now. So when businesses are engaging or defining their employee value proposition, the mirroring is very similar to the way how they're engaging consumers. All right, so but there is. If you think that the entity is the same and ultimately the values that they spruik internally should be the same as that they spruik externally, then there's a confluence of values irrespective of where the person is. And this is the whole issue here, is that why do you have to make a distinction between one or the other for the sake of depending on if the person is a customer or is an employee? And the reason why that these businesses are compelled to do that is because they've passed over, or they accept the scope of they accept the product of a consumer primarily first. And also, they never address you as a person, is what I'm saying, because of the way how that they've defined your agency as far as you being a consumer as to what you can buy and your labour as to what you can sell. So, and they do that through the fact that they place you in a market. Now, when you're looking at potentialising you as a person, so that is engaging you to potentialise your time to therefore create with other people and to engender a culture beyond obviously the whole purview of commercial enterprise. Well, you don't have to have an employee value proposition just as much as you don't have to have an external or a values that you tout to the market. Because once again, we're talking about the nature of the way how values are beholden to a good that is secondary, and we talked about, or subordinate to the preeminent good of your time, which is the main thing that you need to be focused on. And the only way that you can engage you as a person and to potentialise your time is to see past basically that secondary value or the good that you are in the market for, and that relates just as much as your consumption as it does as you as a producer or what the work that you do for the business. Now, a lot of the businesses will then engage you internally with wellness programs, and so therefore they very much are approximating or trying to engage you as a person to look at the environment that is nurturing enough that obviously to ensure your loyalty. But it's no different to the way how they're soliciting loyalty in the scenario of positioning themselves in the market. It's just an internal market for labour just as much as an external market for consumption. But the whole thing, and this is where the issue is, it's about loyalty, all right? They're trying to engender loyalty. So in the case of consumption, it's monetization. In the case of, obviously, of an employee, it's not monetization at all. It's your productive capability. It's your expertise. It's what you can offer. But they are basically two faces of the same coin. Now, when you go beyond that and potentialise a culture that exists outside the market, obviously the person is not beholden to the loyalty to the enterprise in the scenario that we're talking about. They are engaged with the actual culture that they are helping create. There is something about it that engages people if they get past the cynicism we've talked about in other episodes and they start to address the apathy and to see actually what is possible. And then they actually do start to engage it, then they have more ownership of not only what they do within a business, because they know that that business is connected with the culture that is outside. They're loyal to what the business stands for, but it doesn't stand for touting values as far as its reduction into monetization or profitability. It extends beyond that with a civilizational enterprise. All right, so that is a key distinction, that when you're looking at the way how art is going to be engendered, you have to look at the way how the two markets have to collapse in order to potentialise you as a person, in order for you to see scope beyond corporate culture, if I can put it like that, to actually start to look at culture as something which is what it is, which relates to ennobling human action beyond the reduction of commercial enterprise. But in the scenario here, so you're looking at the way how the time it takes for that to be engendered. So there has to be an allowance for that way of approaching you as a person to unfold. Now, if it's done in a manner where business is so set upon monetising and about generating some kind of return that they don't have allowance to see this through, then they're only going to reap the cynicism of positioning themselves in the market with values, because then it becomes virtue signalling. But if they do it in a way where, like I said, it's in an ecosystem of enterprise good, and enterprise good is a custodian of the idea, and they defer to the authority of enterprise good, then ultimately the cynicism can be broken, and then obviously, people can see the possibility that they otherwise is levelled off if they never give it any due consideration, because for the sake of the cynicism that is engendered. Now, when you do that, obviously you're addressing the latent self of the person, the limitations that you accept, the fact of how you can create. So we're talking about the nature of creativity here, which is nothing else than an artful way, an artful activity. Now, the way how this is done, it can be done, it's all very nebulous, but we're talking about the way how events get engendered outside the context of that becomes a counterpart sign to the exceptions that businesses make of your commerce in order to potentialise your time to see a possibility that's there, that through iteration becomes actual through events and whatnot, that substantiates the culture, that is not beholden to the enterprise as in businesses, but actually is beholden to the community, the world that you actually are help creating, engendering through these acts. Now, you do that. It's all about the time given, the allowance for you to see that manifest. But one of the things that is critical is that if time, and in this scenario, we're talking about the way how that your time as a supplement is potentialised beyond the economic good that you secure for yourself when in your labouring. All right, so it's not seeing it as an economic good; it is basically the transmutation that occurs as a result of potentialising it beyond that. Then what you're doing is that if time is not money, all right, then there is it doesn't work as a constraint to work against what is produced. All right, so now what does that mean when I say that? So if time is not money, then it is no constraint working against what is produced. So that means to say that you can't produce a commodity. You can't if things start to be done artfully, because if its time is not a constraint in the sense that you have to economize, or you have to economize the means of the factors of production. But then what underwrites that, which is economized independent of the factors of production, which is obviously time, and we take time as a thing, but it's literally no thing. All right, then to remove time as far as time that underwrites the production of a good or an item as such means to say that it starts to be produced artfully, because something that is produced artfully, time is removed as a thing to be economized for art to be produced. It's not a constraint. You don't have to work against it. Now, and the scenario here is that if you're not using time is not economized, then you don't have to overproduce to maximize the return on the time by producing commodities. All right, this is the thing, because time underwrites the production of commodities. So the nature of what you're setting up when you're engaging yourself as a person at the outset of the confluence of markets is you're potentialising the ability of the way how goods can be created without time being a constraint, whereby that if it's not a constraint, then obviously it doesn't have to be economised, and then you don't have to produce more in order to maximise a return. Now, the way how that's engendered is through the culture that supports the acts, ultimately. That's what we're talking about. It's extremely localised in the sense that if you are creating a culture, and it's global just as much as it is local, because this thing can work on in so many different kind of locations where it can span the globe. You're sharing the same way of doing things, but then it's localised in the community that you're engendering or that you are supporting where you are. And like I said, a lot of businesses always tout the whole nature of their community support or their initiatives, but it's always at arm's length. It's never in the market or the place where these companies usually are incorporated. They take community there as a given, or if they address it community, it's always from a deprivation kind of mindset where they're addressing maybe certain inequalities or deprivation, as it were. It's never addressing a spiritual deprivation, which is a key distinction here, that ultimately is spiritual deprivation. It just allows material deprivation to persist. This is the whole issue, that you address the spiritual deprivation, and it can't allow material deprivation to exist. It's impossible, because what you're doing is that you are changing the way how people give and receive. You're ennobling human action. People would not accept basically material deprivation, but the reason why it persists is because, like I said, we're beholden to this utopian understanding. You can't see externalities like pollution or the way how you externalise human relations for the sake of the time that you're orientated towards. And so therefore any nature of material deprivation that may persist, it's kind of hard to see that, because you're in your little bubble, as it were, and this is where narcissism gets engendered, because of the intrapersonal exchanges that we're always engaged in, because it's a lifestyle pursuit, and then it's the model that you are emulating, as it were. So that in and of itself sets us on the way of engaging in the co-creative aspect of people at large to create a culture that supports the removal of time as a constraint, so things are given artfully. So you remove time as a constraint, then by default of that removal of time, you don't have to maximise a return on time. And so the good that is produced goes from being produced as a commodity to slowly being produced as basically an artefact, or done artfully and is art. And that's the key distinction. That's the way how this thing gets unfolds or manifests itself or reveals itself over time. But it's very much contingent upon addressing, I've said this in prior episodes, addressing you as the main product. All right, you're the main product. The monetization of your attention is nothing else than indicates the tacit acknowledgement that your consciousness is the actual market itself. So once again, we have to look at what can be engendered to see past that, to engender something that's beyond, that's unique, novel, that is completely diverges from that worldview or that reduction or that impoverishment, in order to remove you as the product that you are. Now, this is the whole thing. You remove you as a product, then what you're doing is by default of removing you as the product, as the consumer, then everything else that follows that. This is the thing, it has to. It can't work any other way. You no longer become a product, a commodity. So therefore the things that are produced within that culture cannot be commodities, because what you're doing is you're undermining your time. The time equals money nexus, the way how you're beholden to your time, is a preeminent good, and this is the way how that you're engendering something that is new, a cultural renewal, an absolute renaissance of culture within our planet, like we haven't seen before, basically. Anyway, until next time, take care.